Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to get started in just a minute. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's very important discussion, Reporting from Occupied Territory, a conversation with Palestinian freelance journalists. My name is Rosina Ali. I'm a contributing writer with New York Times Magazine and also a Cullman Fellow at the New York Public Library, where I am working on a book about Islamophobia in the United States. I'm very happy to be moderating today's panel, which should be discussed more given the ongoing conflict in Israel-Palestine, how central that conflict is in US politics, and just how much we rely on journalists on the ground for information about continued occupation. I thank Jewish Currents and the Freelance Solidarity Project for putting this event together. Founded in 1946, Jewish Currents is a magazine committed to the rich tradition of thought, activism, and culture of the Jewish left, and the left more broadly. The Freelance Solidarity Project is a movement of freelance media workers organizing under the banner of the National Writers Union to improve conditions and build solidarity throughout the industry and the labor movement at large. And if you're not familiar with either of these organizations, definitely check them out. They're doing incredible and important work. With that, I am so pleased to introduce our impressive panelists today. Lara Abu Ramadan is a journalist, visual artist, and co-founder of Refugee Eye organization. Lara was born and raised in Gaza City and is now located in the San Francisco Bay Area. Dalia Hatifa is a multimedia journalist specializing in Israeli-Palestinian affairs and regional Middle East issues. She also writes about religion and immigration in the US, and you can find her writing in the Washington Post, Time, New York Review of Books, among other places. Ahmed Alvaz is an independent journalist and documentary filmmaker. He's based in the West Bank and he focuses on Palestinian-Israeli affairs. Thank you all so much for being with us today from very different time zones across the world. I just wanted to let the audience know that we're going to have a discussion and then we're going to open up the conversation to you guys for questions. So if you have any questions throughout, feel free to just enter it in the Q&A box down below your Zoom screen. So Laura, Dalia, Ahmed, thank you so much for being with us today. I thought we could start by talking about some of the main challenges that you guys have faced reporting from the ground. And I thought, Dalia, we could start with you. These challenges, I've kept it somewhat broad because I want to understand what you consider some of the main risks and challenges while you're reporting.
Thanks a lot for hosting this. This is such an important topic. I want to start off with a famous line by Edward Said, where he argued that Palestinians have long been denied the permission to narrate. And I think the impact on the permission to narrate starts at home for Palestinian journalists. In particular, we face more severe restrictions than many of our peers. Many of us are banned from travel. There are movement restrictions on our work. And the restrictions and the decisions that are issued against Palestinian journalists by Israeli authorities increase during and after specific political or security events, and in conjunction with their publishing, reports, photos, or videos, whether through traditional or social media that document Israeli violations or criticize Israeli policies. That's one. So basically, they're scrutinized for their work, and then there are ramifications for their work. And then the second point I want to make is that there's also the imposition of unspoken rules by mostly Western mainstream media in the occupied territories, which often sidelines Palestinian journalists in favor of Western journalists who most of the time, I would say, don't know Arabic. And it pigeonholes the former into fixers or translators. And this isn't to say that fixers or translators are by any means not important. They are super important, except that they should be the ones who are able to tell the story. These Palestinian journalists, often have to know everything and everyone in the occupied territories, but their knowledge and expertise most often doesn't lead them down the pathway towards becoming correspondents or reporters. And herein lies the problem. It's the inability to write your own narrative as a Palestinian.
Thank you, Dalia. One of the things that you mentioned, specifically your last point about fixers and or at least local journalists having to play fixers for foreign journalists, that tension we find in many places around the world, and it's a structural problem. But in Palestine, Israel specifically, it seems more acute because of just how the conversation about this conflict is usually narrated, at least in the US. And Lara, I know that we've talked a bit about, just this tension between how much credit fixers versus foreign journalists get. And I wondered if you could touch a bit more on that.
Thank you, Rosina. And thanks everyone for being here today. I think my experience working in Gaza as a fixer and translator for a few years before leaving to the US was a challenging experience. Working as a translator for foreign journalists, that was challenging in a way that, first of all, we don't get the credit. Second of all, we don't get paid at all, or maybe just something not to be mentioned. And I feel this is, for us as journalists living under these circumstances, living under, first of all, occupation and blockade, that is a whole different situation, I guess, than in other areas in Palestine, where you don't have to interact with the Israeli occupation or soldiers, but it's in a different way, in a more psychological way. So I feel in Gaza, the freedom of being able to get permission from the Hamas government to be able to receive this foreign journalists coming to Gaza, I feel there is like, first of all, not very mindful questions about the situation in there. Me as a fixer, as a Palestinian who lived under 3 wars, each after war, when I translate to foreign journalists, it becomes as asking question, repeating the trauma, which is like, tell us what happened with you. Or for example, like how many kids did you lose in, or like how many family members, which is like, they already know the answer sometimes. But I feel like also translating that and asking that, it feels like unmindful sometimes. Yeah, again, with not being able to be credited or giving opportunities. The unemployment high rate in Palestine, in Gaza specifically, is over 44%. And most of the youth, they graduate, they speak English, they studied like anyone else, like they have the ability to be able to work, but then there's not that availability for them to be able to report and talk about the situation. And yeah, there is not much freedom of that to be able to talk about the situation in there as well.
So do you guys find that it's difficult to, obviously not getting credit is really disheartening, but also do you find that within that you are not able to perhaps push or talk about or cover certain types of stories because of the fact that the foreign journalists are the ones who might have a particular lens of this conflict?
I feel exactly, yeah. If you don't mind, please repeating your last point again.
Yeah, well, let me just simplify it a bit. Do you feel that there are stories that you guys, when you have to be the fixer or be the local journalist on the ground, can't actually push in Western media or cover in Western media?
Yeah, I feel like in the case in Gaza, there is always this stereotype of repeating the same subjects and topics about Gaza, which is, talking about always like the war and like picturing Gaza in that specific way. And I feel there are like many underlying topics and situations that like also we need to give more attention to, which is like how is like the youth and more of like inspiring stories of young people in there and their ability not to be able to leave, and the other, like it's more of a whole future for these people who are like still living that every day. And I feel choosing specific topics about keeping it like political, which is true, it is political, but also humanizing the people who live there and talking more about like what are their daily life is like, and what are the lack of things that it needs to be changed and addressed in mainstream medias. So yeah, I feel like people in Gaza are fed up of like being pictured as people who lose their houses and they lose their family members. It is a reality, but also what is the change? I feel that as like a journalist, like you're also role is being able to change something in the narrative and being able to convey like more of like a reality idea of the situation and not keep repeating the same narratives and picturing people in a specific way. And then what is the kind of change in that way as for your role as a journalist?
Ahmed, I wanted to get your thoughts on this and also ask you about some of the challenges about a movement I know you cover the West Bank. How does the challenges of just, moving, being able to move around and not, how does that affect your work? And sorry, before you start, it might be actually helpful if you could explain to our viewers just what those logistical challenges are.
Of course. As someone mainly reporting from the occupied West Bank, I always feel that to succeed in your profession and your career as a journalist is a matter of luck. It depends on where you were born, what kind of document do you have, what color of ID do you have. And based on that answer, everything will be changed, you know. So maybe we should start by mentioning the most simple example, which is Gaza. Like if you're a Gazan journalist born there, you have the idea of Gaza, that's the end of your career. You're stuck there and you can only work and report from within these 360 kilometers square, which is a very tiny plot of the world. I was born, I've been living most of my life in the West Bank. I have the West Bank ID, which is jointly issued by the Israeli Ministry of Defense and the Palestinian Authority, which means I'm also subjected to the Israeli military rule, which puts me under so many restrictions. For example, I can move only within parts of the West Bank. So, which means also I can also practice my career there. And here we're talking about something like less than 20% of the whole country. And when I talk about the whole country, I count the whole mandatory Palestine, also known as Israel, because issues are connected and you need to be able to report from Jaffa and Nablus to produce a story. You need to be able to report also from Jerusalem, where almost all political decisions are taken there, or in the so-called Tel Aviv. And if you are a freelancer, it adds also a lot of difficulties for obtaining these permits from the military. I started having a permit only 2 years ago, which allows me to travel everywhere across the country except for Gaza. And since that time, I started working more freely. Yeah, but I can say that not all journalists can get this. You need a really big organization to be in your pack in order to get this. And even with that permit, there are so many restrictions. So for example, like when I cross the checkpoints, I cannot drive cars while settlers can, for example. Or you guys, if you come to report from Jerusalem, you can. So which means I have to be moving through transportation. The matter even of walking in streets after 10 p.m., it's illegal. I could be detained because these permits usually come with certain rules that you have to obey to. Like even if you want to think about which press card can you have, I feel the real one in the country is one card, which is issued by the Israeli government. It's called as the GPO. But of course, as a Palestinian person, I cannot get it. I can get other types of cards, which are not really efficient from my limited experience. So it depends on which type of ID do you have. All of these answers can be, all of these questions can be answers. I also can say that it also affects your access to information. So, for example, for me, it's never okay to call the Israeli military government and get information from them. Like this never happens because I don't think they will accept such a call. Even if you, for example, get it in touch with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Interior Affairs, this is not something that happens here. The whole dynamic is weird. And I can confirm that even if you're Palestinian based in Haifa, which means that you have the Israeli citizenship, Israeli government always tend to decline these requests unless you work for an Israeli governmental media outlet, such as Makan or Kan or these names. And this is very essential because here we're talking about the main source of information in this country. Israel is in charge of every centimeter in this country. And if you want to report about any issue, you need to get this information from the direct sources. So sometimes I feel that all of our reporting is kind of recycling. We just have to follow the Hebrew news. We just have to follow international journalists who can get this information, and we just reference them in our reporting. There is a whole list of restrictions that I cannot summarize in such a short answer, but I can say in the end that based on all of what I have been mentioning, by the end of the day, you tend to lose your opportunity to work as a freelancer or a journalist here in this country And simply media outlets will tend to employ international journalists who have more freedom to move across the whole country, who have access, the so-called access to the both sides, who have access to the governmental institutions that I don't have. And this is why, for example, all of the big names, the big players in the media industry have international journalists, and usually based in Israeli-controlled areas like Tel Aviv, West Jerusalem, and these areas.
Yes, it seems like, yeah, go ahead, Dalia.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in and say, maybe clarify something about having access to Israeli governmental sources. I would say that it is very difficult for a Palestinian to have such access and to have not just access, but to be able to have that information in a timely fashion. But I wouldn't say that it's impossible, because like I often get this kind of information. I call up, whether the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs or COGAT or any of these places. Granted, I do get answers, days later after the story has been published. But most of the time, I don't think anyone's ever asked me if I was Palestinian, and this isn't by any means, an attempt at like defending, how Israeli authorities behave when it comes to Palestinian journalists. But I'm saying that there is a possibility that you can have access to that information. It's just very difficult. And as Ahmed mentioned, the GPO card, which is the golden ticket, so to speak, is not something that we have. Like, I don't have it. I'm often worried that, like, I'd be stopped somewhere at a checkpoint and I wouldn't be able to kind of justify where I am or have anything, because technically I have no credentials. So yeah, it's a big problem, and you have to have a very big organization to back you up. You have to have an organization that's based in Jerusalem, and it has to pay Israeli taxes, and that's how you as a Palestinian journalist are allowed to get the so-called GPO card.
That's a very difficult position for freelancers to be in. And I wonder if you guys, when pitching stories to media outlets and editors, are you finding that they're making the calculation of access versus knowledge of the area?
Absolutely. I've had organizations that basically have told me, like, after I've pitched, after I've written to them like about 100 times, and they're like, okay, do you have permission from the Israeli authorities to be there? I was like, no, but they're not going to give me anything, that it's just not going to happen. And they're like, we're sorry, like, there's nothing we can do. And you basically end up losing a gig or an opportunity, or, just a chance to be able to tell a story that, it specifically caters to the needs of this one organization.
Yeah, I feel like the situation in Gaza, it's a bit also kind of like the same but different in a way, which is you need to also like keep pitching the idea, and like most likely no one would get back to you or answer your emails regarding pitching specific ideas, but because they have already specific agenda of what are the things that they want to talk about in Gaza. And of course, asking about the question was like, what kind of access or permission do you have? That's not a question that they would think about that we need to get inside Gaza. I feel like you're talking about the GPO and like these things. It's a whole different thing like that. I'm not aware of that being a journalist in Gaza, because we have a whole different situation that the only permission that we need to get is from Hamas government. And it's kind of around the same idea, which is like if you are backed by a big organization, you'll most likely be allowed to go on the street and cover specific stories. But also, I feel like we in Gaza as Palestinian journalists, we kind of have all these challenging of what what are the things that we're allowed to talk about and what are not? What are like the specific kind of reporting that you want to do without being actually questioned, million of questions and interrogated by the Hamas government? Like, why would you cover these specific areas around the border? So there's like immediately like there's like this suspicion that puts a lot of kind of pressure on the journalist, being that it feels like you're doing something wrong, but it's not, you're not actually, you're just like reporting. So there are like limits of what are the topics that you want to talk about Gaza. And this sometimes not helping of what are the whole kind of pictures and the details and the stories that are people in there living every day, since like we are stuck there for over 16 years, not being able to travel. Feel like even like opportunities of getting participating in like a conference or anything, these things always we lose it because we're just staying there. So what are like other options that we're gonna do? And most of the whole situation, which is giving the priority to foreign journalists, specifically to be able to enter Gaza, which is not everyone can do. And when they do, they don't really talk about what we need to address to the public.
Yeah, that's a great point. I didn't even think about just the restrictions on even networking or building contacts, going to conferences, meeting other journalists, which is so critical for freelancers, especially.
Mm-hmm.
Ahmed, I wondered if you could talk a bit about your experience with Palestinian authorities on the ground, and if you have faced restrictions from them.
Yeah. So in reference to the Palestinian Authority, although it's not a real government that is operating here, but we're talking about baby suppressive regime that if it turns into a state one day, we will have also some black days. That's my personal opinion. And we can see the symptoms right now. Also, the access to information is not a right granted to journalists so far. There is no law for that yet here. And it really depends on the mood of the official to grant you an interview or to get you into a meeting hall to listen to what's happening inside these governmental arenas. And I can say that also the PA security forces are usually very sensitive to cameras highlighting them. And yeah, but by the end of the day, you know, the amount of time that you can spend in a PA detention because of a violation that you can do as a journalist, in my opinion, is something limited. However, if you are falling into a trouble with the Israeli government, that's something different for someone classified like me, because you have to go through all of these military courts. And yeah, you may be in jail for, I don't know, something like 6 months or 2 years. It depends on you charge if they classify your work as incitement or something like that.
I wanted to turn to an issue that I think is at the forefront of in many of our minds, which is the murder of Palestinian journalist Shireen al-Akleh by Israeli forces. It took months for the Biden administration to condemn the killing, even after investigations by mainstream media outlets found that an Israeli soldier had killed Shireen. And, you know, I can imagine that this was disturbing on many levels. But I wondered from you guys, how did this episode make you feel as as a journalist, as someone working on the ground? Was this a turning point in terms of how you consider your work and the type of support you might get from in the international world? Dalia, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So for me, this is a particularly sensitive issue because Shireen was my friend and my colleague. And so I feel very passionately about it. I feel like it's a personal issue and not just, a journalism issue, but I'll talk about it from the focal point of the media, obviously. I think that Shireen did everything right that day on May 11th when she went to Jenin to cover this Israeli military raid. She was wearing her helmet and her vest. And Shireen often did this thing where when she knows that the Israeli soldiers are around, she would go and stand right in front of them and to show the cameraman, to show her crew, to tell them we are here, and they were within sight. So the fact that they shot at her repeatedly, even after she clearly died immediately, shows that this was targeted, it was intentional. And unfortunately, the Israeli government is getting away with it with US acquiescence and European acquiescence, I would say. The US has, determined that somehow they don't know who killed her, but that somehow it wasn't intentional, which makes no sense. But I would say that also it scares me to think that even an American citizen who is supposed to have all these, let's say, special, like, what's the word? Special privileges, let's say. They're supposed to have them, but they don't, because ultimately, Shireen never told anybody that she was an American citizen, because she was also an East Jerusalem ID holder. And she was always afraid that if the Israeli authorities found out, they would take away her East Jerusalem ID, which is usually the case, because you're not allowed to be a dual citizen. Even though East Jerusalemites do not hold a passport, they merely hold a laissez-passer or a document issued by Jordan. So again, you're constantly faced with these Kafkaesque kind of situations and bureaucratic situations that make you do things that leave you in fear, leave you unknowing of how to approach things. But for Shireen, she's been doing this, she was doing this for 3 decades, and she knew the West Bank like the palm of her hand. She knew never to put herself in harm's way. She never wanted to be a martyr. She never aspired to be some sort of hero or a diva, even though she was the most well-known, I would say, journalist, not just female journalist, but war correspondent. And she never let it get to her head or anything of the sort. But at the end of the day, even when she did everything that she was supposed to do, she still was killed. And that leaves a mark on a lot of journalists, especially like freelance journalists or journalists who don't have any, foreign country that can support them or anything of the sort, because ultimately, if you die, you die. And that's the case of for example, of Yasser Murtaja, who was killed in Gaza, I believe in 2018. I could be wrong, but there was an uproar about it, and the Israeli government promised an investigation, and we never heard about it ever again. It was swept under the rug. In fact, they had the audacity to say that he was a member of Hamas, and they tried to pin some things on him. And that leads us to another situation, which is what Israel does in the event that it kills a journalist, which is to muddy waters from the get-go, so that people have this shadow of a doubt that one of its own killed this journalist. And this is what happened with Shireen, is that from the get-go, we were told that Palestinian fighters were behind the killing, and they never retracted it, even after several dozen, I would say, media outlets launched their own probes, human rights organizations, Israeli rights organizations. Everybody determined the same thing, which is she was killed by an Israeli soldier. But if you speak to the Israeli government, you'll never get a clear answer, unfortunately.
Thank you, Dalia, and I'm sorry for your loss. I didn't realize she was a good friend. Lara and Ahmed, did you guys want to talk about this?
Yeah, I want to add another thing, reporting from the border areas or the invasions that happens in Gaza during the wars or during the regular days. It's really sad that Israel finds a way always to justify killing journalists and finding another reason that whoever, whatever their opinions, that's why they were killed, to kind of make it less criminal that you're killing journalists who are wearing a vest. Even if they weren't wearing a vest, killing people is not justified at all. And the story of Shireen and Yasser Murtaja and Fadl Shana'a and a lot of Palestinian journalists who have been killed from the Israeli occupation. This, unfortunately, you hear it in the news at that time, and then you don't hear about it again. And it's unfortunate that even if you are wearing a protective gear or not, that you're going to be targeted. And the idea that everyone is trying to talk about it on media, it's not like really changing anything regarding that. It's really sad, and it's unfortunate that we have to go through this. And I feel like as a journalist working in like a war zone area or like under occupation, it feels that I'm always having that in mind, that I might not pass this day. I might not actually make it. Who knows? Because once you are on the border areas, you have all this adrenaline that you need to be able to convey whatever is happening, to take photos of the situation or a video, and be able to manage not to be hit by any bullets that are coming towards you, or even the tear gas on the border areas, like what happened back in 2018 and different times before that and after that. It's just I don't know. I'm always questioning, like, when is this gonna change, and when like humans in Gaza gonna be able to be seen as anyone else in the world. I'm living here in the US right now, and I see how much is like valuable the human life is. Like, what about the 2 million people who are living in Gaza? What about the journalists and like the freedom of speech that we are supposed to have, and to talk about the situation in a clear way, I guess.
Thank you, Lara. Ahmed, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I also share the same feeling with my colleagues. Like, whenever I have an assignment, I need to go to the field. And whenever there is a protest or clashes or something tension like that, I have the question if I will go back to my home very well as I left it, like without losing an eye, without getting a gas canister in my face. And it happens a lot. And we get suppressed a lot by the Israeli military. And this is something that we don't tweet about it when it happens with us, because it happens almost every time we go to the field. And here I have a more complex argument than the one that says Israel wants to hide the truth and they want to eliminate journalists because they want the area not to be covered. I don't think this is the case of this place. This model happens in other places in the world, but not here, in my personal opinion. I think the main problem is that the Israeli soldier is not ready to give the privilege to the Palestinian journalist as a journalist. So even if you're wearing a protective gear, even if you're highlighting your press card, you're showing it to them. Once they know you're Palestinian, they tell you, "Halas, go away, don't discuss." There is no room for discussion. And this is the main problem. And this is why within my limited experience, I witnessed many of my colleagues either losing eyes or losing kidneys because of getting shot even before the protest starts. Sometimes you don't understand the reason. And I think, and it's an opinion, it's not a fact, I think this is part of what happened with Shireen Abu Akleh. Shireen Abu Akleh was not targeted because she is Shireen. If they wanted her, they could have raided her house, detained her. But she was, I think, in a refugee camp where I covered a lot in my life, Jenin refugee camp, a group of journalists, and for some reason, maybe the soldier felt that he needs to shoot a certain group of people. Maybe he saw that they are journalists, maybe he not. But the easiest option to do is just to shoot. Why not? Who's gonna following you? And if you want to say that he did not know that she's a journalist, now that soldier or that government is very highlighted. He was very unlucky because she was Shireen Abu Akleh. But it happened, for example, with less privileged journalists. This year, she was killed in Al Arub refugee camp, if I'm not mistaken. And it was not much highlighted in the news. So this is my main problem as someone doing work in the field. And I can tell you, for example, about one incident that happened to me personally. I can wrap it up with this. 3 years ago, I was covering in South Hebron Hills, and the military came and announced the area as a closed military zone. And under the Israeli military law, within 10 minutes, you have to leave, and it doesn't matter if you're a doctor, if you're a journalist, you could be detained. And this is something usual that happens with me like every maybe single day that I go to the field. So I just didn't pay attention to what he's saying. And we stayed in the field, hoping that they will not arrest us because we are very visible that we're journalists. But it was not my luck day. I was detained by a soldier who didn't like me taking photos of him while detaining people. And yeah, I spent something like 9 hours in one of the military detention centers in Hebron. And while interrogating me, they didn't ask me anything about why did I take photos. They didn't even touch my camera. They were not really interested in the material that I was getting, but they asked me questions like, hey, why did you not, for example, listen to the soldier when he announced that it is a closed military zone? I told him I'm a journalist doing my work. But he told me, yeah, despite that, you should have left and you're doing a violation. So they gave me a ban from being in that area for something like 30 or 45 days. I cannot remember. And they put on me something that we call here a police ban, which means that I'm not entitled anymore for asking for movement permits. If you apply for them, you will be rejected because simply you're on the blacklist. So that lasted on me only because of what I have explained on you, because of doing my work, that Israel is not ready to understand. You're Palestinian, you have the green ID, this means that you're subjected to the military rule. It doesn't matter, you could be questioned even if you're a journalist.
Yeah, I think it's something that all of you guys have, brought up, which is so disturbing about Shireen's case, is that she was well known and she had institutional backing. And I wonder, in a context like this, to what extent is the category of freelancer salient? I mean, does it matter if you're a freelancer versus someone who's part of the staff?
I think in this context, I mean, it doesn't matter because ultimately Shireen was shot because she was a journalist. I don't think the soldier who was shooting, he may or may not have known that it was Shireen Abu Akleh and she has, an institution behind her, but he shot her because she was a journalist. So even freelancers who wear vests and helmets, if they're lucky to have them because they're super expensive, may or may not get targeted as well. I would say the importance of an institution comes from the fact that you never cover these issues alone. There is something to be said about being in a group. Like when I was, when I freelance, when I go out in the West Bank, I always try to go with other journalists because I know for a fact that I need their, not just their physical support, but their emotional support as well. And there's something to be said about, larger numbers, like, helping each other out and ensuring that you're not alone, because I've been in situations where, you know, it's just me and a bunch of soldiers, and like I mean, I'm obviously trained to know what to do, but as Ahmed had mentioned earlier, like it's very there's no rhyme or reason to it. So anything can happen, and even with a group, you could get shot. I mean, a lot of journalists with groups have been shot. So unfortunately, there's no clear answer, but I would say for myself, I always tend to ensure that I am with other people when I go out in the field, because I'm a freelancer, and because like I know that it's way more dangerous for me to be alone than to have other colleagues with me.
Yeah, thank you. You touched upon this. I'm going to turn to Q&A in just a minute, but before I do so, I wanted to ask you guys a last question. Is, what kind of solidarity would you guys like to see from editors, other journalists, people, because it's obviously very clearly so difficult and uniquely challenging to cover this region. How would you guys like to be supported?
I think the simple question, which is just asking us, like, is it safe for you to be there? What are the challenges that you might face? What are the things that you need? What kind of permission do you have to go through? And what kind of threat that this would be to your life, and to be able to talk about that specific subject that they want us to cover. I guess, like, yeah, just asking those questions and being mindful about what are the challenges, so they are aware if anything happened to me or other journalists, that what is the reason, so they can stand up at some point for us if they were able to talk about, okay, so this journalist mentioned that earlier before covering this, so we know what is the reason. I feel that would help in my case, being like a journalist in Gaza, I guess.
Yeah. Ahmed Zalia, would you like to add anything before we turn into Q&A?
I don't really have anything to say, except that maybe an association of some sort. I know we have like a Palestinian syndicate. I don't know how effective it is. I've seen that sometimes they try to help out when like the Palestinian Authority arrests journalists, but I mean, that's about it. And I don't believe in their, capacity or even intent, or yeah, unfortunately, it's not a very good representative for Palestinian journalists. So perhaps maybe a union, like a real union of some sort, something that represents Palestinian journalists and like fights for their rights and speaks up for them. It's a very obviously broad idea, but something along those lines.
Yeah.
I can say very quickly that I don't feel there is an efficient body to help Palestinian journalists here, at least in the country. Even the syndicate that my colleague has mentioned, I don't feel it's being very helpful. Even because by the end of the day, they are Palestinians like us. So in some situations, they cannot really intervene. So I don't have a magic answer, like what could be the solution, but I feel sometimes that we journalists try to support each other. So, for example, if I have to go alone to a certain place, I just try to inform a colleague that I'm going to that place at that time. Especially, I'm here talking as a freelancer, which means there is no real media outlet behind me. So I have to inform at least a colleague who can follow up with me. In some situation, I got help with from journalists who have the Israeli citizenships, even Palestinians who are living in the 1948 territory. In some situations, I got my memory cards. It happened with me confiscated. I'm not the one who speaks Hebrew. I don't have the ability to like run a conversation with the military leadership of my district, at least in Nablus. So I had to ask for the help of that one who facilitated the process of getting back that ID. So I feel this is the maximum that we can do so far.
So I'm going to turn it to Q&A, and we have a lot of great questions. We are sort of running out of time, but there's some great ones. So let's try to get through whichever ones we can. We have a question about audience. How do you think about who your audience is? And how does that change depending on the medium and languages you're working in?
Maybe can I start?
Please.
So I think this question depends on the media outlet we're contributing to. I tend to work with political media outlets, and by that I mean media outlets that say their political position clearly about Palestine, Israel. For example, you guys could be an example, the Jewish Currents, which is a very honest practice, by the way. So honestly, as a freelancer being based here, I feel that I can get an access to these outlets because these guys are not representing the mainstream media outlets, and they can listen to my pitch, maybe accept it, cooperate with me to develop it. So we tend to have opportunities there. But when it gets to bigger names, mainstream ones, I don't want to mention any, it's more difficult. I'm not sure about the answer, but maybe they trust international journalists who are usually sent from the north to report here. Maybe they have their people who are already based in Jaffa or other Israeli-controlled areas. But I don't feel that we usually have the opportunity to have our voice there, which is also efficient to have our voice there or our reporting there, because at such platforms, you tend to speak to more neutral people who are still questioning their position from the Palestinian-Israeli question. I'm not only speaking to people from, I don't know, the same background, or people who are supporting the Palestinian question, for example, who tend to follow maybe the Jewish Currents, Plus 972, Electronic Intifada, or any of these names that focus on Palestine, Israel.
We have a question about the role of US and European governments. What would you want to see from US government and American and European media to make the work of Palestinian journalists more possible and more relevant? Lara or Dalia, would you guys like to start?
I'm still thinking about it. What is the role that they can do?
Honestly, I mean, there's a difference between like expectation and you know, what we'd like for them to do. I don't expect them to do anything, to be honest. What I would like them to do is, I mean, the least of it, at least, is to cater to the needs of journalists when it comes to amplifying their skill sets. So, you know, organizing trainings, ensuring that people get visas to go to the places where they need to go, you know, to attend conferences, to talk to other journalists, or to learn a new skill and all these things. But even this is the lowest this is the lowest I would say point, or the least point, the least thing that they could do. And it's often their governments that work against journalists who are in fact invited by, let's say, an NGO or like a media outlet to do training or to do anything, and the obstacles are usually, you know, things like visas or things like being denied or not providing enough opportunities for journalists to train. And I'm not saying that training, you know, abroad is better than training in Palestine, but, you know, I think Palestinian journalists should have access to the world, and they should have access to other journalists who may or may not have different, you know, circumstances and experiences. So this is just like, we have a saying in Arabic, it's أضعف الإيمان, which I cannot translate in English, but it just means that this is the least they can do, basically.
Yeah, thank you. Laura, did you want to add anything to this?
I think adding to that is having more of a list of the people who are on ground there and try to push to be able to give them opportunities and to give them protecting gears and stuff like that. Because when I worked as a journalist there, I didn't have any protective gear and I wasn't sure how I can get that or like where. So I feel like providing the resources more in a clear way for people who are on the ground there. And again, asking them what are the things that they need, what are the challenging parts that they go through. And yeah, Palestinian journalists, as Dalia said, they need to have opportunities to be able to be engaged with the outside world, since we are always just being there and receiving the outside world. But no, we want to be able also to be outside, to see how the world is functioning in a different way, in a different privilege, and be able to come back and have a wider thought of how to deal with topics and how to deal with covering the situation in there from the lens of how the world also see that. I guess that would be helpful for us. And you know, like I wish I knew that when I was back in Gaza. I have a little bit of awareness about this, but you know, being here working as a freelance in the US, that gave me more of a feedback or an idea and insight of how is actually the journalism in the outside world is functioning and how limited resources we have back in Gaza and the West Bank.
Yeah, that's great. You actually touched upon a question that someone had, which was, do journalists in the occupied territories need help in buying the protective gear they need? And sounds like they definitely do. We have time for one more question, and I wanted to ask you guys something that one of our audience members asked. What is the state of labor organizing among Palestinian freelance media workers today? And is there a relationship between that organizing and other labor movements in Palestine?
I don't know if anybody else wants to kind of answer that. I'm happy to pass the mic, so to speak.
I haven't heard of any organizations or like union for workers back in Gaza, at least in my experience. And I feel like even if that existed, they're always going to be under the same challenges, which is who are the people you're going to support, what are the topics that you're going to talk about, and questioning every step that they need to be able to do to support the other journalists or like workers in the strip. So it's kind of like under the same restrictions of to what limit you are free to be supported, I guess.
Dalia Ahmed, do you want to add to this?
I mean, I haven't seen or heard of anything in the West Bank to that effect. I think it's a great idea. I tend to congregate fellow freelancers when I can, but like on a more personal level. But it would be really interesting to be able to do that like on an official level. But then once you do that, you're going to go through hoops of bureaucracy, and it's just, honestly, it's not even worth it. I say just pick your tribe and try to work together and try to keep each other safe and informed. And I think it's better than an actual official thing that the Palestinian Authority can kind of, you know, clamp down on or try to control or something of the sort. And again, it's going to have, you know, it's going to have the same kind of problems that the actual syndicate we mentioned earlier, you know, has. So yeah, just do your own thing. It's my opinion.
No, thank you. That's great. And actually, it seems like there's so much more to dig into. And I hope we get a chance to continue this conversation further at another time. I want to thank you all for joining us. And thank you especially to the panelists, Dalia Hatoufa, Lara Abu Ramadan, and Ahmed Albaz, for this really insightful conversation. And thank you again to Jewish Currents and the Freelance Solidarity Project for putting this event together. Thank you all.
Thank you.